Good evening, and welcome to the University of Tulsa College of Law 21st Annual Buck Colbert Franklin Memorial Civil Rights Lecture. I am Lynn Entzeroth. I am Dean of the University of Tulsa College of Law. And I thank you for joining us this evening for this event. Our featured speaker this evening is author, lawyer, consultant, and scholar, Hannibal Johnson. It is always a privilege to host the Buck Colbert Franklin Lecture and to introduce our speaker. This lecture is particularly poignant this year as the city, the state, and our nation mark the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa Race Massacre, and where we mourn the victims of that tragic event and also learn about the legacy and resilience of Black Wall Street and the Greenwood District. Tonight's distinguished lecture series was created in memory of Buck Colbert Franklin, a courageous, forward-thinking lawyer who in the beginning of the 20th century was Oklahoma's first African-American lawyer. Mr. Franklin was also the father of the eminent historian and civil rights advocate, John Hope Franklin, and the grandfather of the distinguished John Whittington Franklin, who is a cultural historian who served at the Smithsonian Institute and was one of the creators of the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C., where he served as a senior manager. In this year, 2021, where we reflect on the horror and the tragedy of the Tulsa Race Massacre and remember and honor its victims, I ask you for just a moment to think about the world that Mr. Franklin grew up in, raised his children, and practiced law. Buck Colbert Franklin was born in 1879 and spent his youth in what was then the Indian Territory that would become the state of Oklahoma. After completing his college education, Mr. Franklin studied law by mail, passed the bar, and began the practice of law. In 1921, 100 years ago, Mr. Franklin moved to Tulsa. He was in the process of relocating his family when the tragic Tulsa Race Massacre occurred. During the violence and the rampage, Mr. Franklin's legal office was destroyed. He lost the home where he and his family had planned to live. But Mr. Franklin was not deterred. He did not turn back. Instead, Mr. Franklin followed his duty in the pursuit of justice. Thus, in the immediate aftermath of the race massacre, working in a tent on the burned-out grounds of the massacre, Mr. Franklin served justice, representing victims and other individuals who were harmed during the massacre. He brought numerous lawsuits on behalf of African American victims, and he won a court decision striking down a City of Tulsa ordinance designed to prevent African Americans from rebuilding their homes in Tulsa. Mr. Franklin continued his career and his path-breaking efforts towards justice and remained active as an attorney in Tulsa until his death in 1960. This week, the University of Tulsa College of Law was able to carry on the legacy of Buck Colbert Franklin and inspire a new generation of lawyers with the creation of the University of Tulsa College of Law Buck Colbert Franklin Legal Clinic. The B.C. Franklin Legal Clinic will serve Greenwood and the North Tulsa communities. This clinic arose out of the College of Law Alumni Board's desire to honor the memory of those lost in the massacre. Last year, the Law Alumni Board established the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre Coalition to raise awareness and to provide and commemorate a community that has demonstrated resilience through tragedy. Our Law Coalition has raised funds for student scholarships and raised matching funds for the B.C. Franklin Legal Clinic. We are blessed and honored that the coalition was chaired by two of our law school alums, Stephanie Jackson and Dwayne Mitchett. Other members of the coalition include the following alumni board members: Law Alumni Board past president Kevin Matthews, and current law board members Mark McCullough, Kim Fink, Kasha Carr, Lori Gilliard, Madison Kaduya, and our third-year law student, Student Bar President J.P. Ray. We are also grateful for the support and encouragement of our Alumni Board President, Tim Rogers, in this effort. The coalition worked closely with clinical professor Mimi Martin and develop and create the B.C. Franklin Legal Clinic. Mr. John W. Franklin graciously agreed to allow the college to use his grandfather's name in honor of the clinic. It is Buck Colbert Franklin's commitment to civil rights, to dignity, to giving voice to the dispossessed and the injured that inspired our new law school clinic and that inspired this lecture series. Each year, we look for speakers whose life's work embodies that passion for justice, that passion for civil rights, and giving individuals a voice. This year in particular, 2021, the Centennial of the abhorrent Tulsa Race Massacre, we particularly wanted our guest speaker to be someone closely tied to the memory of the Tulsa Race Massacre, someone who knows this city's tragedy and sorrow, but also its strength and resilience. It is therefore my privilege to welcome and introduce the distinguished Hannibal Johnson this evening as our speaker for the 21st Buck Colbert Franklin Memorial Civil Rights Lecture. Mr. Johnson is an attorney, an author, and an independent consultant where he specializes in diversity, inclusion, and cultural competency issues. Mr. Johnson has an undergraduate degree in economics and sociology from the University of Arkansas and a JD from Harvard Law School. Mr. Johnson also has taught as an adjunct professor at the University of Tulsa College of Law, Oklahoma State University, and the University of Oklahoma. He has taught courses on ethics, law, legal writing, business, cultural diversity, the Tulsa Race Massacre, nonprofit leadership, and management. Mr. Johnson's role as an educator, though, extends far beyond the classroom and beyond the state of Oklahoma. For example, Mr. Johnson serves on the federally created 400 Years of African American History Commission, which has planned, erected, and implemented appropriate and relevant programming related to the 400th anniversary of the 1619 anniversary of Africans arriving in the English colonies in Virginia. He also chaired the board of directors of the Community Leadership Association, which is an international leadership organization. His civic work in Tulsa and Oklahoma is extraordinary. Just a small sampling of his work includes service as chair of the Education Committee for the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre Centennial Commission, past president of Leadership Tulsa, the Metropolitan Tulsa Urban League, and Northeast Oklahoma Black Lawyers Association. He served as the founding director of Oklahoma's Appleseed Center for Law and Justice. He is the past chair of the Oklahoma Department of Libraries and also has served on the Oklahoma Advisory Committee for the United States Commission on Civil Rights. He has served on program committees honoring John Hope Franklin and for the John Hope Franklin Reconciliation Center. He is also a noted historian and author, and his books include Images of America, Tulsa Historic Greenwood District, Black Wall Street, From Riot to Renaissance in Tulsa's Historic Greenwood District, Up from the Ashes, A Story About Community, Acres of Aspiration, The All-Black Towns of Oklahoma, Mama Used to Say, Wit and Wisdom from the Heart and Soul, No Place Like Home, A Story About an All-Black, all-American town. Apartheid in Indian country, seen red over black disenfranchisement. And Sawyers of Chandler, a pioneering power couple in pre-civil rights Oklahoma. Johnson's play, Big Mama Speaks, a Tulsa Race Massacre riot survivor's story, has been performed at the Tulsa Performing Arts Center, the Philbrook Museum of Art, and Just Governance for Human Security Conference in Switzerland. Big Mama was also selected for the 2011 National Black Theater Festival in North Carolina. Mr. Johnson also wrote and narrated an RSU TV program about the Tulsa Greenwood District, a documentary entitled Black Wall Street Remembered. Among his many honors, Mr. Johnson has received the Inclusive, a diversity award from the Young Tulsa Professionals, the Ada Loa Scipio Diversity Award from the Oklahoma Bar Association, and Keeping the Dream Alive Award from the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Commemoration Society. It is truly an honor to welcome Hannibal Johnson to deliver this evening's presentation, Affirming America's Promise.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm honored to stand before you to deliver the Buck Colbert Franklin Lecture. I'm honored by the company I'm in, the meritorious and distinguished individuals who have come before me. I dedicate these remarks to my late parents, Frank and Bernice Johnson, who lived their lives in such a way as to set an example of service for my siblings and me. My father, Frank Johnson, served as president of the Mineral Wells, Texas chapter of the NAACP in the late 1960s. I know firsthand what the NAACP has meant to African Americans, to all Americans, since its founding in 1909. Just think where we might be without it. My mother, Bernice Johnson, served in many capacities in the little churches we attended in my formative years. She felt a special calling to serve and lived her life consistently in accordance with that calling. I've chosen as my theme, Affirming America's Promise. I consider the hard-fought battles for African American civil rights a legacy to which I am a direct heir. I respect that, I cherish that, I honor that. I feel an obligation to make things even better. Accountability for upholding America's high ideals and lofty promises must be ongoing. Affirming America's promise is the responsibility of each of us, a process that requires ongoing vigilance, constructive engagement, and positive action. The as yet incomplete struggle by African Americans to affirm America's promise is arguably the defining tension in United States history, challenging America's grand ideals by shining a light on her often harsh, ugly realities. Yet, we do a poor job acknowledging it, talking about it, and teaching it. We deserve better. We are better. We must do better. Unless we do better, we risk generations of children of all hues who are oblivious to some of our nation's more powerful moments and movements. Generations of children who underappreciate the legacy they've been left. It's been 155 years since the ratification of the 13th Amendment, which ended, technically and theoretically, the institution of slavery, begun in 1619. The 13th Amendment declared neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for crime wherever the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. It's been more than 160 years since the United States Supreme Court declared black folks have no rights white folks are bound to respect in the now infamous Dred Scott decision. It's been more than 120 years since that same court declared legal separation of the races to be fully constitutional in Plessy versus Ferguson. It's been more than 60 years since Brown versus Board of Education, with all deliberate speed, ever so slightly cracked open a window of educational opportunity for African American children. It's been more than 60 years since we saw the mangled, grotesque body of young Emmett Till beaten to death at the hands of two white men in Mississippi who would be acquitted by an all-white jury for their heinous crime. It's been more than 60 years since the Little Rock Nine, protected by federal troops, endured taunts and terrors so they could attend that city's well-funded, state-of-the-art high school, Little Rock Central. It's been almost 60 years since the March on Washington in 1963, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It's been 30 years since the brutal beating of Rodney King at the hands of the Los Angeles Police Department set out national unrest and highlighted police brutality. Let's review and process that. Beginning just over 400 years ago and continuing for about 250 years, white people enslaved African-descended people, sold them, and dehumanized them. Simultaneously, white men crafted the country, its laws, and its systems of government. Multiple generations of white families got to grow and flourish and make choices that could make their lives better. About 150 years ago, white people freed black people from slavery. But there was backlash. Angry white people created laws that disenfranchised and dispossessed these newly freed black Americans, made it impossible for them to vote. Voting and land ownership and basic civil rights belonged, in many quarters, to whites only. White people even erected monuments glorifying people who actively had fought to keep black Americans enslaved. Again, multiple generations of white families got to grow and accumulate wealth and gain land and get an education. About 60 years ago, after much tumult and with much fanfare, we made it legal for black people to vote and to be free from discrimination. But even then, angry white people still fought to keep schools segregated. They closed off neighborhoods to white people only. They made it harder for black people to get bank loans or to get a quality education or to get health care or to marry a white person. All the while, additional generations of white families got to grow and pass their wealth down to their children and to their children's children. Today, technology makes it public for the horrors of black Americans to be seen. The beatings, the stop and frisk laws, the unequal distribution of justice, the police brutality, and only now, after 400 plus years and 20 plus generations of a white head start, are we starting in earnest to dialogue about what it means to be black in America, and by contrast, what it means to be white and experience the mostly unacknowledged privilege that brings. As a country, we are witnessing a moment which, if sustained, may qualify as a bona fide movement. Calls for social justice continue to mount as more Americans come to grips with the yawning gulf between American ideals and American experiences, particularly for black folks. It is, in many quarters, morning in America again. The touchstone phrase of what is widely considered the modern civil rights crusade, Black Lives Matter, I can't breathe, say my name, these phrases simply did not resonate in the social justice space just a few years ago. Now in America, these phrases define the mission of advocates, activists, and allies who aim to transform law enforcement and eradicate structural, systemic racism. As our elders often remind us, you can't know where you're going unless you know where you've been. It's all interconnected. We are lost without our history. When we take a look back, it's clear we've been deep in a valley of oppression. It is equally clear that we've steadily lifted ourselves up, despite temporary setbacks. On this day, we continue our climb on dual tracks: self-help, readying ourselves to seize opportunities as they arise, and governmental accountability, making sure America keeps her end of the bargain by leveling the playing field. We are still working our way up the mountaintop, looking up and over and glimpsing the promised land, that place where justice rains down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream. It is this magnificent journey that has gotten us where we are today, and so long as we keep our eyes on the prize, will take us to even greater heights. We have made great strides, no doubt, undeniable, but we are not there yet. To borrow a line from Dr. King's famous 1963 "I Have a Dream" speech, now is the time to make real the promises of democracy. Black Lives Matter has taken this challenge to heart. The movement has taken control of the social justice narrative, particularly since the protest over the murder of George Floyd by police in Minneapolis in 2020 and the seemingly endless chain of other troubling black deaths at the hands of law enforcement officers. Founded in 2013 in response to the acquittal of Trayvon Martin's murderer, Black Lives Matter works to eradicate white supremacy and build local power to intervene in violence inflicted on black communities by state and by vigilantes. Its values include diversity, equity, and inclusion, affirmation of all, and affirmation of the humanity inherent in the black lives of individuals in particular. Despite indisputable evidence to the contrary, there are those who cannot or choose not to see the well-documented, gaping race-based disparities that exist across all indicia of well-being in America. In the face of denial, there are nonetheless increasing calls to declare systemic racism a public health crisis, one that shortens the lives of black and brown people, people of color, and diminishes the quality of those abbreviated lives in being. Again, we have made advances, no question, but the advances we've made have proven threatening to some who feel a loss of privilege, white privilege in particular, as black and brown numbers and aspirations continue to rise. These are folks who see life in we-they terms, as a zero-sum game. In this worldview, when we, African Americans, people of color, make gains, they, white people, suffer losses. It's all about maintaining institutional power and privilege. The desire to hold on to power and to privilege makes people behave badly, very badly. There are still those among us who exploit race and stoke the fires of hate and fear for personal and political gain. We can all likely think of examples. We have to acknowledge the gulfs rooted in our history that divide us. To do that requires that we learn, in many cases, the history we don't know. So let's look at Oklahoma and its unique history. Oklahoma means land of the red people in the Choctaw language. Spanish explorers and their African servants passed through here in the 1500s. Native Americans from the so-called 5 civilized tribes, together with African slaves and freed Africans, were resettled here in the 1830s and 1840s after forced migrations from the southeastern United States. After the collapse of Reconstruction in the late 1870s, African Americans flooded out of the Deep South in search of better lives. These so-called exodusters changed the landscape of Oklahoma. They created all-black towns and settlements, like Boley, like Langston. They carved out commerce centers in segregated towns like Tulsa, the home of the nationally renowned African-American entrepreneurial community dubbed Black Wall Street. So you see, Oklahoma history going back centuries has been shaped by the interrelationships between and among Native Americans, European Americans, and African Americans. We've lived, worked, and played together, though not always harmoniously, for generations. Beginning in the last quarter of the 20th century, we experienced an explosion in the Latinx or Hispanic population in Tulsa and in Oklahoma City and in some rural communities. We've seen growth in our Asian and Eastern European demographics as well. On the one hand, Native Americans, African Americans, and Hispanics or Latinx have historically seen Oklahoma as a land of hope and promise. On the other hand, Oklahoma has, on far too many occasions, dashed those hopes and breached those promises. The allure of Oklahoma has, for some, turned out to be an illusion. Our state's first official legislation, Senate Bill No. 1 in 1907, codified Jim Crow, segregation, as the law of the land. Forcible assimilation of Native Americans resulted in the near annihilation of many native tongues. The economic exploitation of Hispanics or Latinx community members is in part responsible for the immigration dilemma we now face. The 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre is a prime example of the perils of ignoring or whitewashing history. The roots of much of the racial divide in Tulsa can be traced back to the failure to acknowledge, to apologize, and to atone for the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. We will not be whole unless and until we embrace and implement that three-step process in connection with the historical racial trauma we suffered 100 years ago and its present manifestations. You know, history has a peculiar way of catching up with us. The kind of silence, deliberate indifference, and obfuscation that characterized Tulsa after the 1921 massacre always shrivels under the sunshine of scrutiny. Sometimes it takes years or decades or even centuries, but history will ultimately be revealed. And in the end, the cover-up doesn't conceal, it only compounds. The wound festers, we all suffer. Healing our history requires openness and honesty. Only relatively recently have Tulsans begun doing what should have been done decades ago. The price paid, and still being paid, for that sloth shows up in continued residential segregation, socioeconomic disparities, and race-based mistrust. The good news, though, is that we're working on it. We're making up for lost time, squandered opportunities, and fractured relationships. Dr. King once said, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." Too often we lose faith in the continuing struggle for equality when progress creeps rather than sprints. We grow impatient as we repeatedly take one step forward, then two steps back. We get frustrated when old battles must be fought on new turf. Yet we should take comfort in Dr. King's words. We should rest assured that if we are vigilant, steadfast in our work, progress is not simply possible, it is inevitable. When I think about our incremental advancement in terms of race and on matters of diversity and equity and inclusion generally, I'm reminded of the words of a civil rights activist who once quipped, "Things ain't like they ought to be. Things ain't like they gonna be. But thank God, things ain't like they was." Indeed. In terms of race, there's been undeniable progress on the national stage. The election of Barack Obama as our 44th president marked an important milestone for our country, for all of us. It offered new hope to those of us who had grown weary of the promise of America. It moved us closer toward our vaunted ideals about equality. It helped restore our tarnished image abroad. He represented something bigger than himself, started years before his birth. Legions of unnamed forefathers and foremothers laid the foundation, literally and figuratively, for his new home, the White House. We should celebrate how far we've come, but let's remember that the journey continues. As important as Barack Obama's historic presidency was, it did not signal an end to our racial problems. They are not yet solved. You know, I heard a lot of talk of a new post-race America after the Barack Obama election in 2008. I know you heard that same talk as well. The problem is I see no evidence whatsoever of such a place. In my world, race is still relevant. Gross racial disparities still exist in virtually all aspects of our lives. Education. The racial achievement gap is real and persistent in virtually all urban school districts, including here in Tulsa. Healthcare. The updated Lewin report here in Tulsa relative to the lifespan disparity demonstrates that life expectancy, even today, is about 11 years shorter for folks living in areas of the black community as compared with the white community. Employment. As a rule, if you want to calculate the black male unemployment rate, all you have to do is double the overall unemployment rate. Hiring discrimination against black job applicants persists. Sociological research has shown that black applicants without a criminal record are less likely to get callbacks from prospective employers than white applicants with a criminal record and just released from prison. Economics professors at MIT noted a significant gap in callbacks for job applicants with white-sounding names versus black-sounding names listed on resumes. Submitting identical resumes online, Brendan, Greg, Emily, and Ann received 50% more callbacks across the board than Tamika, Aisha, Rashid, and Tyrone. Poverty. The overall black poverty rate is almost triple that of whites. The criminal justice system. Studies indicate that black folks are treated less favorably at virtually every stage of the criminal justice system, from arrest to indictment to prosecution to conviction. African Americans are disproportionately represented among the incarcerated. Now, given these alarming data points, please tell me where to find post-race America. The data suggests no such place exists. Moreover, the election of President Donald Trump signaled, for some at least, a backlash against the first black president of these United States, a firm rebuke to the notions of inclusivity and equal justice and racial reconciliation that seem tantalizingly within our grasp. President Trump did little to diminish such a signal during his term in office. In addition to these particular disparities, polls also indicate that both black and white Americans continue to rank racism and prejudice as significant concerns. We have to be willing to dig deep to get to the root causes of these unacceptable inequities. I'm reminded of the parable of the river. So a group of villagers were standing at a riverbank. The villagers suddenly heard the cries of a baby. Shocked, they saw an infant floating, drowning in the water. One person immediately dove in to rescue the child, but as she did, yet another baby came floating down the river, and then another, and another, and another. By now frantic, the villagers continued to jump in to save the babies. One man, however, walked away from the group, still on shore. A village elder shouted, "Where are you going? We need everyone here on shore to save these babies." The man replied, "I'm going upstream to stop whoever's throwing these babies into the river. Leadership isn't always popular, but it's necessary for us to deal with fundamental problems instead of just the symptoms of those problems. We need to address the institutional, structural, systemic issues that we've too long neglected. Our challenges today around race are no longer simply bilateral. The discussion has to be broader than black and white, and it has to extend beyond race to the other dimensions of diversity that make us who we are. Intersectionality, that web of diversities within, between, and among us, must be given its due. We are faced with varied and complex diversity and inclusion issues. Working through them will require sustained dialogue, personal and institutional commitments, and investments of time and money. I am confident that within this community, within our state, and within this nation, there's a critical mass of people who recognize that we must leverage our diversity and foster inclusion if we are to be competitive in the 21st century. This 21st century world is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. The issues we face require 360-degree leadership, leadership from all of us, not just African Americans, not just people of color, but all of us. From disparities in economic health, wealth, and well-being, to educational achievement gaps, to civic engagement, to criminal justice, we cannot go it alone and expect positive results. What have you done? What are you doing? What are you willing to do? I challenge each of you to let your presence be felt and your voice be heard. Register if you're not already a registered voter, and vote in every election, local, state, and national. Those who came before us paid a heavy price to ensure that your constitutional rights are respected. Not voting dishonors them. Work with your public school system, whether you have children in school or not. That system is educating our successors, so we'd better make sure it's doing a good job. Work with your local chambers of commerce to promote business and economic development generally, and to give voice to the economic needs of all sectors of the community. Pay attention to the world around you. Watch for changes in law that are regressive and not progressive in terms of the interest of the least among us. Know your elected representatives so that you can challenge measures that run counter to your social justice ideals. Support those organizations that have a track record of success at challenging bias, bigotry, and racism. And lead. It might mean mentoring a child. It might mean assisting your neighborhood association. It might mean running for elective office. Lead in some way, in your own way, and make a commitment to make a difference. In her last will and testament, Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune, founder of Bethune-Cookman University in Daytona, Florida, left us ways to live abundantly, ways to help affirm America's promise. She listed among her gifts to us, I leave you love. I leave you hope. I leave you the challenge of developing confidence in one another. I leave you a thirst for education. I leave you respect for the uses of power. I leave you faith. I leave you racial dignity. I leave you a desire to live harmoniously with your fellow men. I leave you, finally, a responsibility to our young people. So said Mary McLeod Bethune in her final will and testament well over a half century ago. Her words still resonate. Let me share the words of another iconic American figure, John Lewis, civil rights icon, American statesman. He said this in his final essay published in the New York Times on July 30th, 2020. When historians pick up their pens to write the story of the 21st century, let them say, that it was your generation who laid down the heavy burdens of hate at last, and that peace finally triumphed over violence, aggression, and war. So I say to you, walk with the wind, brothers and sisters, and let the spirit of peace and the power of everlasting love be your guide. What an honorable messenger. What wonderful words to live by. What essential guidance for our work in affirming America's promise. Thank you.
I want to thank Hannibal Johnson for his inspired presentation this evening. I hope you all enjoyed it. Thank you, and have a good evening.